Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Dill. I am a professor and director of the Transportation Research and Education Center here at Portland State University. And I am very happy to be introducing and hosting today's seminar with my hands full here. So our Friday transportation seminars have been a tradition on the PSU campus since the year 2000. Portland State is located on the ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, and Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important that we acknowledge that we are here because of the sacrifices forced on the indigenous ancestors of this place. Remember these communities and honor their legacy, lives, and descendants. Today, I am very excited to have a group of our students presenting on a street perspective about safety interventions for houseless pedestrians. The students are all about to graduate from our Masters of Urban and Regional Planning program here at Portland State, an award-winning, highly ranked program that I am very proud of. And the students we have presenting today include the team of Peter. No, I'm sorry, I'm laughing because I made sure that I knew how to pronounce everyone's name and now I'm overthinking it. Peter Domine, Nick Meusch, Asif, Haque, Angie Martinez, Sean Doyle, and Meisha Whyte. And I'm very happy to have you all here. So Street Perspective, which is the name of their team, is a team of 6 MURP students from a variety of backgrounds, interests, and experience. They are all committed to making Portland and other cities safer, more equitable, and more accessible places for all residents. Before jumping into their wonderful presentation, though, I need to take the opportunity to highlight one of TREC's summer programs that you or your colleagues may be interested in, and that is our Ibpi faculty workshop, which is a 2-day course supporting transportation planning and engineering faculty on how to integrate bicycle and pedestrian topics into their courses. And we'll put the link to that in the chat. Attending a Zoom webinar, the students will make their presentation, and then at the end we will handle questions. If you could put your questions in the Q&A box, we will handle them at the end. And also, let's see, AICP credit is available, and at the, I'm going to say this now, I usually say it at the end, but forget, at the very end of the seminar, when you log off, there will be a short survey that we would appreciate you filling out. And I think with that, I am going to turn it over to our students. And first up, pin this on your, would that be easy? Okay, and then I'm going to switch the slides. All right.
Okay, it's working. Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Dill. Good morning, everyone. My name is Angie Martinez. I'm the project manager of the Street Perspective team. We are, as Dr. Doyle mentioned, we are a group of 6 second-year students of the Masters in Urban and Regional Planning at Portland State University. And there we are. So on behalf of my team, I want to thank the TREC seminar for the invitation. We are excited and honored to be here and for this opportunity to share a bit of our work. So this project is part of the MURP workshop. So the MURP workshop is a required course for graduate students in the MURP program. And this course is intended to give students a hands-on experience in conceiving, planning, and implementing a community-based planning project in close consultation with a client and partner. So today we are going to talk about safety interventions for houseless pedestrians, which is a project that started with a request by the Portland Bureau of Transportation to examine it was a request from Pbot to examine how to mitigate the risk of traffic-related harm to people experiencing houselessness. So to accomplish this, we conducted an in-depth qualitative and quantitative analysis of the traffic safety threats faced by houseless pedestrians, and we also developed a toolkit of actions that Pbot can take to address those threats. So the reason why behind this request has to do with a devastating impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on housing and shelter services. As a result of the pandemic, many more people are living on the streets, exacerbating Okay, good, perfect. Yeah, so as I was mentioning, the reason behind this request has to do with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in housing and shelter services. So as a result of this, more people are living in the streets, and more people are facing these traffic safety threats. So according to Pbot, 63 people were killed in traffic crashes on Portland streets and highways in 2021. 60% of these fatalities occurred on the Haque crash network. So the Haque crash network is the Pbot's identified network of streets and intersections with the highest number of crashes for motor vehicles, pedestrians, and bicycles. So out of these total fatal crashes in 2021, 27 were pedestrians and 19 were reported as people experiencing houselessness, which represents the 70% of these crashes. We acknowledge the complex nature of this crisis of houselessness in Portland and across the nation. And for that reason, it's crucial for us to approach this project with equity, compassion, and humility at the forefront. So as part of our equity approach, we aligned our scope and recommendations for this project with Pbot's Vision Zero definition of traffic safety, which aims to create streets that are safe for all the Portlanders in all areas of the city to move by all modes. And we also, for this project, we are using the term houseless or unhoused rather than the traditional term, traditionally used term homeless. So as the nonprofit Do Good Multnomah describes it, home is a social connection, it's memories, it's the street, it's friends, it's family. It's much more than physical space. So something important to mention is that since we started this project, we knew that the scope of our work was not to analyze or address the entirety of houselessness, but to understand its relationship with traffic safety. So with this in mind, and having a problem statement defined, we were able to formulate the following research questions. So the first one, how do we mitigate the risk of traffic-related harm to people experiencing houselessness? And then how does the houselessness issue apply to traffic safety and how it affects people living in this situation? Now I will pass it off to my colleague Asif, who will discuss the methodology for the data analysis that sheds light on the issue.
Okay, thank you, Angie, for the warm introduction. So the motivation of our work is to serve people experiencing houselessness on Portland streets who are most vulnerable to traffic-related harm. People experiencing houselessness in Portland are disproportionately people of color or identify with having a physical disability or a mental illness. Before the rise in traffic fatalities disproportionately among people experiencing houselessness in Portland in 2021, 1 in 4 were killed in 2020 due to physical trauma, which includes traffic injuries. So this compelled us to prioritize our analysis of existing conditions in what we call conflict zones. So a conflict zone is where a campsite, a crash, and the high crash network are within a distance of 250 feet of each other. So an average city block is about 300 to 325 feet. So a conflict zone, in other words, is where a campsite, a crash, and a high crash network are less than a city block length away from each other. We looked at motor vehicle crashes with pedestrians from 2019 and campsites reported in week 3 of February 2022. A focus on conflict zones narrowed our scope by prioritizing campsites with the highest traffic safety risk. So half of the campsites and crashes in conflict zones were at 3 locations. We titled these Burnside, Hollywood, and Hazelwood. The table lists the high crash corridors across all locations. The bolded corridors have the most campsites within 250 feet compared to their adjacent corridors. Almost 2/3 of the campsites in conflict zones displayed here on this map are at the Burnside and Hollywood locations, with 4 crashes located from Southwest 14th Avenue to 2nd Avenue on West Burnside Road. The density of current and proposed services and available lands for shelter or refuge decreases moving east, but public transportation connects campsites in conflict zones east of the Willamette River to these basic needs. So here's a closer look at the Hollywood location where there were 4 campsites and 4 crashes in conflict zones. And then here's a closer look further east at the Hazelwood location where there were 2 campsites and 5 crashes in conflict zones with another crash and campsite in a conflict zone in Russellville. So from here, I'm going to begin talking about the methodology of how we created our map layers and our shapefiles. And basically, our methodology begins with inputting the initial data set into the geoprocessing tool in ArcGIS Pro, then inputting the relevant parameters into that tool, and afterwards running the tool, and then checking the data set output. So campsites and crashes were selected if they were within a distance of 250 feet of the high crash network. The selections were then exported into respective data sets because they were the primary interests of the existing conditions analysis. So campsites near the high crash network were then selected if they were within 250 feet of a crash near the high crash network. And so this selection was then exported into a data set of campsites in conflict zones, which were the campsites most vulnerable to traffic-related harm. So then next we started an analysis of publicly owned lands. So public lands were selected and exported if they were owned by and located in the city of Portland. This filtered out thousands of publicly owned land parcels in Portland, in the greater metropolitan area, and even outside the urban growth boundary. Okay, so lands owned by and located in Portland were then selected and exported if they were within a quarter-mile distance of a campsite near the high crash network. So this is to respect the maximum distance a pedestrian is willing to walk to a destination when considering sites to select. So then city lands within walking distance of a campsite with a high traffic safety risk were selected next and exported based on the following property code descriptions in this flow chart. So this kept lands with the most relevant land uses for shelter or refuge. So specified city lands near the most vulnerable campsites were finally selected and exported if they were 700 square feet or larger. So this excluded lands that could not feasibly provide shelter or refuge at all for at least a couple people. So then next, the following analysis of Pbot lands underwent its own process. So first, Pbot lands 20,000 square feet or larger were selected regardless of land use, regardless of distance from campsites, distance from transit stops, and then they were exported into a respective data set. So this resulted in a data set of Pbot lands that meet the minimum area requirement for a safe rest village, unconstrained again by land use or other parameters. And then Pbot lands were selected again and then exported into a respective data set if they were parking lots, vacant lots, or improved vacant lands with an area of 700 square feet or larger. And so this is to consider Pbot lands that are not large enough to be safe rest villages, but are possibly suitable for sanctioned camping. So these are our data sources, and as you can see, we compiled and used a variety of sources from a variety of locations. So the reported reported campsite data from week 3 of February 2022 was copied, pasted, and transposed from an ArcGIS online map layer attribute table that's managed by the Homelessness and Urban Camping Impact Reduction Program, One Point of Contact campsite reporting system. Data on pedestrian crashes and Pbot claimed lands were retrieved internally from Pbot's ArcGIS division. Data on previously proposed Pbot lands for safe rest village sites came from a news release by Commissioner Dan Ryan in summer 2021. And then the remaining data sets were accessed through the Portland Maps, Open Data, and TriMet Geospatial Data websites. So the crash data and the campsite reporting data in particular are updated periodically. New crash data comes annually and new campsite reporting data comes weekly. And so this means that this methodology can be reiterated for each time new data becomes available. And so the iterability of this methodology means that you can see the change over time of existing conflict zones that are previously found. And then you can also discover new conflict zones that are found with the new data. So from here, I will hand off to my colleague, Nick, who will further discuss the Burnside, Hollywood, and Hazelwood locations. Thank you.
Thanks, Asif. So as Asif was saying, once we had the conflict zone data, we identified 3 areas with the highest density of conflict zones. These include that side on the left, the west side, which is West Burnside, and in the middle is the Hollywood area near Hollywood Transit Center, and then Hazelwood over in the auto-centric area of East Portland. So with these sites, we conducted field investigations, and we took 3 site visits per day over 2 days for each of the sites, one on the weekend and one on a weekday, in order to understand the different travel patterns that automobiles, pedestrians, and bicycles take and how they interact with each other. Once we conducted these site visits and took photos, we put together 3 different maps that had conflict zones that we interpreted as conflict zones and potential missing infrastructure. And also we counted the number of campsites and RVs during our first visit at each of the sites. So this is the first site. It is West Burnside and Northwest 2nd Avenue, as well as Northwest 3rd. And you can see the camping is in that upper northwest corner there, and there's conflict zones around the camping sites. And the camping is located in that area because there are quite a few service providers serving them. And then also you have Waterfront Park on the eastern side where the Saturday market occurs, and you have tourist destinations like Voodoo Donuts in the area. And with all these sites that we're looking at, they are commercial zoning areas, but with different built environment contexts. So this one is a mix of pedestrian and high vehicle speeds along West Burnside. And as you can see, there's also a max stop on First, and pedestrians go up either the stairs or have to go up Second to cross Burnside. And we saw that there was a missing crosswalk where you can look at that gray 2 there, that pedestrians do indeed cross. And you can see that in the left-hand photo, that it's an unmarked crossing, but pedestrians cross it all day, every day. To the right, you can see pedestrians crossing the street, and impatient drivers just continue to make right turns or left turns despite the pedestrians not making it fully to the opposite curb. So these are the some of the Burnside photos. This next map is the Northeast Sandy Boulevard, Northeast Halsey, and Northeast Cesar Chavez map. And at this location, what stood out the most was the number of people crossing to Target from the north side to that south side, and that Target area is located right over here. And then you also have Hollywood Transit Center where all those Bs are for buses, and then there is a max stop there as well. So a lot of the pedestrian traffic is in that area, and cars are moving fast to get onto I-84, either from Northeast Halsey, or they're getting off I-84 where that conflict zone 4 is, where there are a lot of campsites. And then there's also a lot of campsites on that west side, which is actually also a very unsafe walking area, as I found at night. Again, this is a commercial area. Sandy Boulevard is also red light protected. So there are red light cameras there, but vehicles are still moving quickly, and that red light camera flashes at least 10 times per hour. So here are some photos. As I talked about, that sidewalk is in the upper left side on Northeast Halsey to Cesar Chavez. You can see pedestrians waiting along Sandy at unmarked crosswalks because the crosswalks are spaced out not enough. And then you can see the lack of mid-street crossing to that Target near the Hollywood Transit Center. There are ADA ramps, but there's nowhere to go from them. And then that I-84 exit where there's a lot of campsites and vehicles are moving quickly, especially when that light is green. And then finally, we have the auto-centric area of Northeast Gleason and Northeast 122nd, where there isn't actually a lot of missing infrastructure unless we included the lack of crosswalk spacing. But the area is highly auto-dominated with, at this intersection, a gas station and 2 fast food restaurants with drive-throughs. And we also noticed while investigating these fast food restaurants, they close at 4 p.m. So they only allow cars to drive through, most likely due to the amount of houseless individuals in the area. In the northeast corner where that CE is located, there is a bottle drop-off location. So a lot of the campsites are likely set up there to access that area, as well as access the nearby Rite Aid and other quick service food options. And here are some photos of that area. There's a high crash intersections along this whole street, and vehicles are still moving quickly through this area. You can see that gas station in the right-hand photo. And a lot of cars make these right turns at these intersections without stopping at a red light. So we saw a lot of near pedestrian vehicle crash misses, near misses. And it was a matter of, just a millisecond between those individuals getting hit. So kind of worrisome there. Now that we had the maps created and the photos and data to go off of, we had an idea of the solutions we wanted to recommend. But before we could do that, we had to look at the promising practices of previous research conducted. And so Meisha will be discussing that now.
Thanks, Nick. Okay, so historically, practices to address people experiencing houselessness have not been at the forefront of infrastructure and infrastructure design and policy. One of the many reasons that practices that I'll mention later are considered a novelty is the lack of intersectional research on houseless individuals. The many gaps that in the data that my group and I stumbled across cannot provide an opportunity for a complete narrative on how the houseless community safety as pedestrians are affected. Considering these limitations, my team and I decided to use the term promising practices opposed to best practices. As you can see here on the screen are the most applicable promising practices we narrowed down. I will not be able to get into all, but I will touch on safe streets, infrastructure, and RV/car camping. As most of us witnessed, Portland and many cities across the US response to COVID-19 has shown the city's capability to adapt rapidly and mitigate urgent crises. In a matter of days, we saw busy streets transformed into safe streets or healthy blocks, creating an open and welcoming space for pedestrians to coexist. Practices such as safe streets have shown an example of how existing infrastructure could be improved and modified towards the safety of pedestrians living unhoused. In addition, building off of existing programs such as neighborhood greenways, safe street initiatives, Pbot could apply similar models or measures towards the high crash network and the houseless community. The next promising practice we narrowed down to was infrastructure. Throughout our research for promising practices concerning safety, speeding cars, erratic driving, and the lack of visibility, such as poor lighting, were recurring issues that we saw come up time and time again. The ongoing issue of crashes caused by speeding has created many well-researched solutions for infrastructure improvements. Improving the lighting in combination with removing on-street obstacles such as parked cars could also improve pedestrian visibility, particularly at dangerous corners, near crosswalks, and at mid-block crossings. In addition, the lack of inclusive and equitable infrastructure adversely affects pedestrian safety, equally is a huge obstacle for people who have disabilities and the elderly population. The unhoused community who have these intersection identities find it challenging and dangerous to navigate Portland streets. Equitable and healthy infrastructure improvements that Pbot can implement and modify for the unhoused pedestrian could range from early inclusive pedestrian crossing signals, changing traffic signals programming to benefit pedestrian flows, or even adding audible signs with green phase and pedestrian detectors that extend clearance and extend clearance time and automate detection. Now turning to RV and car camping. Safe parking programs for RV and car camping could improve the safety of unhoused pedestrians. During our partial spatial analysis that Asif executed excellently, few areas were highlighted as ideal spaces that could be modified to house RV and car camping. RV and car camping could improve overall security by providing a safe space and accessibility to hygiene stations for the unhoused community. Safe spaces and access to hygiene stations are top priorities that both service providers and the unhoused community strongly advocated for during our outreach in our engagement phase. Sean, the engagement lead, will present our outreach during our engagement phase and dive into the rich information that we as a group are forever grateful to have been shared with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Meisha. So throughout the process, we conducted community engagement, and our goals really boiled down to wanting a diversity of perspectives from experts, including people experiencing houselessness, that would then inform our research and recommendations. So we had 4 main steps in that process. The first was interviewing service organizations that interface directly with people experiencing houselessness. And these then informed our interviews that we had with people experiencing houselessness themselves. Then we analyzed all of these interviews for takeaways and themes to inform our recommendations. And then once we had our preliminary recommendations, we took those back to the service providers that we'd spoken with initially for feedback so we could improve those. So we spoke with 6 service providers and we had 12 interviews with people experiencing houselessness. So that's the basic process. And next I'm going to talk about some of the takeaways from each of those sets of interviews along with a couple of quotes of what we actually heard. So the first point here, when our partner interviews, we heard repeatedly about the cascade of negative effects that comes from the regular clearing of houseless communities. Service providers talked about how sweeping results in the lack of people's personal belongings, including medication, IDs, their tents. It destroys and disperses communities, increases desperation and interpersonal violence, inflicts unnecessary stress and trauma, and is a regular and cyclical form of displacement. The second point here is that houseless encampments are better understood as houseless communities, but none of that is reflected in the way that we talk about or treat people experiencing houselessness. Many of the negative effects that come from harassment and sweeping are due to this loss of community that provides people with some sense of stability and connection. And encampments is not a humanizing term, and campsites is, and so we strove in our report to use this kind of humanizing language. And then the third point here is just that service providers shared with us there was a shared perception that people experiencing houselessness were targeted with traffic violence. And I think this third quote here really pulls all these 3 points together. With sweeps and neighborhood violence increasing, the only place for our guests to go that they can be guaranteed some level of consistency with their housing is the places that put them at risk, where there aren't housed neighbors there to mess with them. And it wasn't just houseless people who were feeling targeted. Service providers, at least one service provider told us that they've stopped using their organizational decals when visiting houseless communities because of the harassment and threats that they've gotten from housed neighbors. And then moving on to our first person interviews. So the first point here is there's no typical person experiencing houselessness. Even though they're often treated as a monolith, everybody is unique. And so no one solution is going to solve houselessness, and no one solution is going to keep people safe from traffic violence. One person in our interviews told us that they wanted a SRO, a single room occupancy unit. Another person talked about a tiny home that would meet their needs. And when people are seeking out shelter, some people seek community in places where there are others, and some people choose to locate where they do because they don't want to be near anybody else. The one thing that all of these people had in common was that they didn't have a permanent abode. The second point here is that we found, with one exception, everybody that we talked to had a personal experience with either a crash or a very close call. Some people recounted being hit multiple times, others while sleeping in their tents. And parking structure exits also came up as a particular point of conflict in a number of these interviews as well. Third, we heard in these interviews that really reiterated what we heard from service providers. People experiencing houselessness themselves felt targeted. This wasn't just a perception amongst what service providers were telling us. One person told us that he's lost his job and has had multiple other jobs threatened because of his need to go back to his tent and prevent losing all of his personal belongings. And another person told us they've been displaced and displaced and displaced by sweeping over the years and have lost everything that they own except what they're wearing at the time multiple times. And then our last point here is just that people felt very targeted because of their housing status. Older people and single women especially felt even more vulnerable because of their identities. And then the last thing that I will end here with, we asked people about specific interventions that we could potentially implement. And I'm not expecting you to read all of these. This is just kind of to demonstrate the volume of things that we heard. Some of these have a lot of overlap between them. Some of them are quite distinct. And many of these showed up in one form or another in our recommendations, which I'm going to turn it over to Peter now to discuss.
Thanks, Sean. Right. So our recommendations toolkit is a combination of our promising practices research and our community engagement. While this project was specifically meant for Pbot as steps they could take to improve traffic safety for houseless communities, both in the near term and in the future, as we've discussed, the issue is far-reaching and needs both citywide and statewide action to create lasting effects. Although we can't go into detail on all of these, I'll provide just the main points from our 4 main categories, which are shelter necessities, pedestrian prioritization and visibility, traffic enforcement and legal protection, and improving information. So for shelter necessities, as we've emphasized quite a lot, our first and foremost recommendation is for the city to stop sweeping. As Sean described, our feedback all emphasize the importance of ending sweeping. Although this is not directly under Pbot's control, the city's practice of sweeping does directly affect the safety of houseless communities on Portland's streets. Our second recommendation is for the creation of Pbot service hubs. Access to necessities such as bathrooms and hygiene facilities is essential to people experiencing houselessness and all require some degree of travel to reach, increasing the risk of traffic-related harm. To counter this, Pbot should use its properties and resources to provide service hubs near existing houseless communities and along the high crash network. As expanding shelter options is so important, exploring any kind of sanctioned car camping should be explored, such as repurposing Pbot-owned parking structures or garages for temporary sites. Similarly, Pbot should review and clarify its procedures for towing of RVs to reduce that burden on people living in them. And as another means to provide access to services, we recommend Pbot create a program similar to the Safe Streets Initiative and Healthy Businesses program to more equitably use the public right-of-way to accommodate services for houseless communities. This could vary in scale, such as closing an entire block or by simply repurposing a parking spot, depending on local need and capacity. For pedestrian prioritization and visibility, our next recommendation is incorporating houselessness into project prioritization. Pbot should create a metric using crash data and campsite data, such as our conflict zones, as a means to prioritize projects. Traditional socioeconomic metrics used to determine project priority don't include houselessness, inadvertently excluding Portland's most vulnerable population. For visibility measures, we recommend Pbot should expand vision clearance, also known as daylighting, such as removing parking at all intersections, both controlled and uncontrolled, citywide. Next, on-street barriers and structures such as Jersey barriers or reflective delineators and traffic cones could be used to not only provide greater visibility, but also as an added layer of protection along high crash corridors in near houseless communities. Similarly, Pbot should expand the application of reflective treatments to curbs along sharp turns and curves and along shoulders, and placement should be prioritized in the conflict zone areas. For our next category, Pedestrian safety enhancements at structured parking exits was also mentioned in our community engagement. Vehicles entering and exiting parking structures was a frequent source of close calls. Pbot should add a combination of warning systems to Pbot parking garages and create development codes for future parking structures. From our observations, locations such as bottle drop facilities were heavily trafficked by houseless individuals. Streets near these and similar locations should be considered for additional traffic calming, intersection, and crossing improvements. For our next category, traffic enforcement and legal protection, the city should expand the implementation of speed cameras, as speeding was a major concern expressed in our engagement, and even small reductions in speed can significantly reduce the harm to a pedestrian in a traffic crash. Speed cameras or even radar trailers in the interim should be posted in conflict zones. Related to this, the city should advocate for change in statewide policy to allow the implementation of a more equitable fine structure for traffic violations, especially speeding linked to income. And finally, the city should advocate to establish housing status as a protected class under state law. Our final recommendations for improving information include an action item within the city's original Vision Zero plan that has yet to be adopted, and that is having a Pbot responder at crashes to evaluate sites for road design and safety. We reviewed 10 fatal crashes involving presumed houseless pedestrians, and there was a clear lack of discussion of road design or driver error and a general tendency toward victim blaming. And lastly, our partner interviews revealed a lack of connection between city agencies and the organizations on the ground with direct knowledge and experience working with houseless communities. Pbot should expand its engagement and establish relationships with houseless service providers and houseless communities to better understand their needs and perspectives.
Okay, so to wrap up our presentation, I'm going to share some of the conclusions and takeaways that we learnings that we had while working in this project. So the first one is that this is a relatively new problem. The number of people experiencing houselessness has grown dramatically in recent years, and this population has not historically been taken into account when prioritizing safety, road safety specifically. And the second takeaway is that people experiencing houselessness face a number of challenges in navigating the streets. For shelter, they need to get shelter, they have necessities, and so these needs lead to a disproportionate risk of traffic-related harm. And the third takeaway is that the solution is more complex than simply sweeping camps near high crash corridors and moving people to safer locations, because in most of the cases, this only exacerbates the problem. And finally, expanding access to services and necessities is crucial to improving the safety and well-being of people experiencing houselessness. Okay, so this is the end of the presentation. Thank you for listening, and now questions are welcome. Thank you.
All right, wonderful presentation. I had all of these students in my class last year. It's so wonderful to see you a little more than a year later, and the wonderful work that you have done. There are several questions that have come in, but I'm going to take my prerogative to ask one to start a little less detailed. So Angie, at the beginning, you explained sort of MURP workshop, and actually maybe you guys, we can all start coming this way. You explained MURP workshop And your client for this project was the Portland Bureau of Transportation. So if you could just explain a little bit to our audience, both live or in person and virtually, sort of the role of the client, like what happens next? You'll produce a report, which will be available online that we'll share when we can. But what happens next, and sort of what response maybe have you already gotten from your client, and either Angie or anyone? I pointed
Sure.
to Angie first. but-
So we were really, so right now the city is currently updating their Vision Zero plan. And we were tasked with looking at this specific problem with houselessness that they just didn't have the capacity to be able to investigate as thoroughly as I think they would like to. So with this toolkit, now we'll turn it over to them, and like this, I think, can guide some of their potential recommendations that they could include in the Vision Zero plan. I think if we had more time with this project, our next step would have been to go to a number of different departments within Pbot to actually, talk about some of the obstacles to implementing these and how they could be overcome. So we didn't get to that point though, just because of the time limits.
Exactly. All right. I have a couple questions data related, so I'm going to ask Asif to come over here. I'm going to assume that you'll answer these. And one was about, they're sort of related. When collecting the collision data, how did you know or find out that the pedestrians were houseless individuals? And related to that is, do you know what percentage of pedestrian fatalities were houseless individuals? So if you could explain the data just a little bit more.
Yeah. So we had data on crashes that came from two sources, technically. So we had data on crashes that came from a 10-year data set from 2010 to 2019. And that was a data set that we retrieved internally from Pbot. And that data set included, how many injuries were there, pedestrian injuries, vehicle injuries, what were the causes of the injuries. But that data set in and of itself did not include like housing status of the people who were involved in those crashes. The data that we retrieved that did include some details and information about housing status of the people who were fatally killed in crashes. That data came from approximately 10 police reports that were also retrieved internally with Pbot. And then those reports included housing status and then more descriptions and descriptors of how the crash happened. And yeah.
And maybe a similar sort of data question. Is there an I'm paraphrasing a little, whoever asked this question. Is there an estimate of the total houseless population? And do you have a sense of maybe what share of that population lives in these higher risk areas?
Yeah, so there were 1,040 campsites that were reported from February 14th to the 20th of 2022. 292 of those 1,040 campsites were within 250 feet of the high crash network. And then 20 of those 292 campsites were in those conflict zones. And so there were 20 campsites that were within 250 feet of the high crash network and also within 250 feet of a pedestrian crash that was within 250 feet of the high crash network.
Oh yeah, maybe. Okay. And now I'm going to go to the room. Wow, our entire audience has questions to ask. And I'm going to walk around. The camera's not going to follow me, but at least we'll get it all on mic. And I'm going to come here first.
Hi. So that data from February 2022, that's obviously a snapshot in time, and then you had site observations afterwards. And I was wondering if you noticed any differences between that data and your site observations, because obviously the people experiencing houselessness are a group that's constantly moving around. So what observations can you take away from that?
I feel like some game show.
Yeah, so to answer your first question, like, yes, we did notice some changes between visits. People had been swept, and where there were camps, there no longer. And I think that kind of gets to the point that Asif was making about how this analysis can be repeated with new data as it emerges. And then I forget exactly what the second question was, but I'll just make the point that sweeping makes it very hard for people to be able to like be found again, to access services. And so I think stopping that would go a long way in really improving people's.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that we did have the extra resource of Google Street View, so we could identify that point in time where we could see what was happening at these sites, and then some of the images were actually only taken a month prior. And then, of course, when Ted Wheeler announced the emergency declaration and started sweeping, the kind of areas changed. But because they're concentrated in commercial areas, people just end up returning or going to another location in these high density areas.
All right, I guess. Quick follow up. I'm gonna get my steps in.
So you mapped out the encampments based on that 2022 data. I was wondering, what is the criteria for defining a encampment based on that?
Yeah, so the campsites are voluntarily reported. So the one point of contact campsite reporting system that's managed by the Homelessness and Urban Camping Impact Reduction Program. It's a voluntary public tool. And so that was the reason why we decided to just use a weekly report, because if we were to exceed use 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks, there would be a level of double counting that we would also be including into that data set that we wouldn't be able to control for. And so that's why we just included worked with a 1 week data set. And then I just want to reiterate that the campsites and conflict zones also approximate for the tendency for people to return. So these campsites were from February 2022 and the crashes were from 2019. But when we visited those sites, we did notice a lot of campsites were still there. But yeah.
All right, man, we have lots of great questions. I'm going to take another one from in the room.
Great presentation. A quick question about the crash, or sorry, the conflict areas. So you said those were based on where crashes or fatalities had occurred. And I guess I'm curious about your thoughts on how do you take your findings and what you've learned to help kind of identify where the next crashes could occur, or how your project can help prevent the next crashes. So.
I don't know who wants to. You're closest. To you, but...
So I guess I'm gonna get to your question about preventing crashes. So the areas that we looked at, there were a high number of crashes there. And so probabilistically, there will be a high number of crashes there again in the future. And so if there are safety interventions that are implemented there in the conflict zones that we've already identified, then that will prevent future crashes. And then I guess touching on to your prior question on using the methodology. So we use 2019 crash data. That's the most recent data that Pbot has internally, but they're going to have 2020 data. They're going to have 2021 data. And so the next team of students or Pbot staff would be able to reiterate this methodology and locate new conflict zones, see whether existing conflict zones are still apparent. And so there's a possibility that there could be difference in different studies. So seeing that we have a conflict zone, the conflict zones that we identified now, the conflict zones that we identified now, if there are safety interventions that are implemented, then later on, in the following year, in the next couple of years, Pbot would be able to see if there are crashes still happening there, and if campsites there are in conflict zones with those crashes. Yeah, does that touch on your question?
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, just to speak to how it, how can this project be effective in places that aren't one of these complicated? So does it help in other areas?
Yeah. So an interesting, so we included the high crash network, but necessarily you don't have to include that as like your third variable. You could just look at crashes and campsites, and that would, keep in a lot of conflict zones instead of just the 20 that we located and identified.
Got another quick comment on that. So some of our recommendations were geared towards like behavior and creating safer streets, particularly lowering speeds. So that would, I think, just prevent crashes generally. And then some of our recommendations are geared towards, reducing the need to travel and providing safer spaces for people to camp where they won't get swept. So I think that kind of gets a little bit towards the future, but like we don't have like a specific interventions for like potential locations or something like that.
All right, and there are a lot of questions online, and we're not going to be able to get to them all, but I'm going to pick this one because it relates a little bit to what you just said. The question is, oh, whoops, I'm looking at the wrong one. I apologize. Okay, I'm going to try to remember it because I think I accidentally pushed it away. Are the behaviors of houseless pedestrians fundamentally different than other pedestrians? And how does that influence sort of your solutions? And the one example the person gave was, for example, perhaps are they spending more time in medians, like standing in medians and things like that put them at higher risk? So maybe speak to that a little bit with your solutions.
Yeah, I mean, I would say like fundamentally, no, like people don't move around the streets differently just because they don't have a house. But they are outside. They're outside all of the time almost. And so they just have like a much higher chance of being hit and killed. And especially when they have been left no other place to go except for these really dangerous locations. Yeah, does that get that question?
We did have a conversation with one service provider who mentioned that there is a tendency for like the way that pedestrians who are unhoused negotiate the traffic and the roadways can be different from how housed pedestrians negotiate the roadway when you take into consideration like the amount of fatigue that people experiencing houselessness like constantly face, along with sleep deprivation, et cetera, and other physical disabilities or mental illnesses that impact and affect like their process of negotiating the roadway.
Checking the room, and sort of a broader question. Could you share with us how the houseless community has reacted to your project? You did mention, I think Sean mentioned you went back at the end and maybe they've heard some of your results since. Who would like to handle this question? Okay, Sean, and I think you can just stay over there.
Sure. So we haven't shared this directly with the people that we interviewed, the houseless individuals that we interviewed, just because, again, like we don't know exactly where they're living. I will note, and I almost mentioned this in the presentation, but I didn't, there's not a strict dividing line between like service providers and people experiencing houselessness. Some of the people that we interviewed as service providers had themselves experienced houselessness or like technically still houseless. And we shared those reports and got generally just positive feedback. We did ask some questions, specific questions about ranking them. How could they be improved? Which ones are like potentially problematic? And so otherwise we didn't really get any like negative feedback, I think, which is generally overwhelmingly positive.
All right, and we're gonna go over time a little bit. I'm just because there's a lot of good questions here, and we've got 6 speakers too. So, and I think maybe because I want to get you all involved here, so maybe this goes to Peter, who I think talked about solutions. And I'm going to try to shorten it. With concerns about sweeps and displacement, have you considered solutions that focus more on bringing the most needed services to the houseless camps to reduce people having to navigate unsafe, risky streets? I think that was part of it. So if you could elaborate a little bit more.
Sure. That I think was one of our main points that we were trying to get at, because obviously providing housing and shelter is the immediate and most necessary solution. But in the meantime, what can we do to get services to people so they don't have to move around as much, so they're not, navigating streets, in dangerous areas just to get to what they need. So that's why we, analyze land uses for potential new safe rest villages or sanctioned car camping, RV camping, as well as, a possible program like the Safe Streets Initiative and Healthy Businesses program to, create some kind of program to more equitably use street space for services. As we discussed a little bit, over the last 2 years of COVID, we've transformed our streets to make them more pedestrian friendly, to expand outdoor dining and stuff. Couldn't we do the same thing for houseless services?
All right. And I think if I speak loudly enough, this mic will pick it up. So we don't have to do but because I'm going to ask you maybe to pass it down. Couple questions about funding. And so in your review, perhaps of the promising practices, did you see anything there about potential funding sources for some of these solutions? Does that come up, or did you address that throughout your project in any way?
We did not get too deep into funding because our recommendations were pretty broad, because you could do an entire project on just one recommendation, really. And this is hopefully just kind of a starting point for Pbot. But generally, I think we were looking to divert funds from other programs such as sweeping and instead invest that into providing services. And towing, how much do they spend? Yeah, spent over $1 million just on towing RVs and cars. So.
Okay. Did you have any data on frequently visited services by houseless persons? And if so, what did you find?
I don't think we had quantitative data, but we had a lot more qualitative data. Restrooms were definitely the number one thing, followed by like general hygiene, hand washing, showers, as well as like access to laundry. Garbage was another big one. The lack of access to laundry, as well as like COVID and all the like takeout containers, like those things just become trash that piles up if there's no place for people to like dispose of it. And then Wi-Fi also Wi-Fi and like power came up as like an emerging necessity just because of how things have moved online in COVID as well. I don't know if there's anything I missed.
Adding on to the electricity part, people who are experiencing houselessness that have had disabilities and utilized power chairs also heavily relied on charging their power chair. So there was an instance where a person I spoke to who was recently on the living on the streets almost got hit by a car due to the fact that their power chair was kind of slowing down, and she couldn't get to the other destination in time. So that's a big thing that I was pretty shocked about, that I didn't think of, is that people who are experiencing these houselessness and have disabilities also need, and having trouble navigating streets, also need these basic needs to get around quicker.
So another thing we found out beyond basic services that are needed is a lot of these people experiencing houselessness, or at least some of them, do have real jobs and are commuting to these real jobs every day, and then going back to their campsite. So they rely on transportation just like everyone else, and they need to be able to access that in a safe way. So I'll just add that.
All right. And a little related, one of the comments Meisha just noted. So in quoting our attendee, in my community, organizations supporting the houseless have reported the vehicles may actually swerve at or accelerate towards houseless people on the street. Did you find similar experiences in your interviews, which I think was mentioned, but I'll let Meisha find more.
Yes, I'm pretty sure Sean and my other group members had this experience, but the woman I spoke about earlier, in particular, said that they've been accosted. They've had house people and unhoused people purposely targeting them or even speeding up towards them or trying to swerve near them, especially during these last 2 years of COVID. The erratic behavior performed through driving has like skyrocketed. And I'm pretty sure Asif, or I'm not sure who, spoke about someone closing the door on someone's tent and just driving off and not aware of that person being dragged in their tent. So
Yeah. I'll just say, like, in all of our interviews, there was kind of the shared perception that people were being targeted, as well as like people felt like people were driving faster through areas where there was lots of people camping, and just like a total disregard for people's safety, like outside of the cars. We had one person who told us like it should be a hate crime to, like, you know, assault people experiencing houselessness because they're houseless.
All right, I'm going to do 2 more questions. I know we're over time, but these are good questions and great topics. So we talked about funding, but another part of this question is the role that TriMet might play, and particularly because the Hollywood, there's the TriMet Transit Center right there in Hollywood, and sort of what role did that come up in your analysis?
So the short answer is that this was focused on Pbot and what Pbot could do. And so most of our recommendations were focused on that. There were some that like kind of got to the city that were out of Pbot's hands, but we didn't really look at like actions that TriMet could take because that was just beyond the scope of this project.
With some of our recommendations, we did mention like which ones would be best, like as like a partnership between city agencies and even partnerships between like city agencies and service providers. Yeah.
All right, and I'm going to end on this question, which is to talk a little bit more about the idea of these sort of the sanctuary streets, providing more details on your vision of repurposing the right of way for services. So talk a little bit more. Going to hand it over to Nick before we wrap up.
So this was based off a 2019 MURP project, actually working with the city of Portland to close down a street to serve the unhoused with storage lockers and other service items such as restrooms, and just a place to gather to access these service provider resources that sometimes become centralized in one area, such as like that West Burnside location, where you could actually have these streets in each of these locations that we identified. We see Portland closing down sections of streets so that you can eat at a restaurant, and that takes away parking. And there are sections of streets closed for residents to bike around safely. It's a matter of doing that for everyone, and not just the people who have the power and the access to get that in place. And currently, although the Safe Streets program offers that for everyone, it's not really for everyone.
I'll make one final point on that. So given this was like geared at Pbot, we had 2 recommendations that kind of got at the Safe Streets concept. So Pbot could establish some like sanctuary street program that would, I think, facilitate, Pbot could facilitate the creation of these or the piloting of these. Then we also think Pbot could use their own land to create some like service hubs where they could place, you know, restrooms, hygiene facilities, and that kind of thing. Both are kind of like getting at the same thing, but it's just whose land it is and who can facilitate it.
All right, with that, I want to thank our wonderful students once again for the great project. I want to thank all of you who attended. And we are done.
And now we have